We've just gone through an analysis of our various video clips to determine how we need to perform color correction. And we've also learned how to read 3 different video scopes in Premiere. So please watch those videos to get context on where we're at in the process. Now, Premiere Pro contains a lot of color correction effects within the effect palette. But its flagship color correction tool is the Lumetri Color toolset, which you access by coming up to Window and then checking Lumetri Color. And then it opens here in a separate panel. At the top, you need to decide whether you're correcting just this clip in the timeline or whether you want to correct the master clip at the source level. For our purposes, I'll just correct this clip in the timeline. Now, there are 6 categories within the Lumetri Color toolset, so there's a lot you can do. Generally, they built this so that you can begin in the basic correction category and then move on to other categories for further adjustments. For now, I'm going to stay entirely within the basic category so you can begin to get some very basic skills under your belt. We'll explore some of the other categories later in this chapter. For this correction, I'm going to work with this image of Esther in her kitchen, which we looked at in the previous videos. Before I make a correction, I just want to remind us of exactly what we determined needed to happen to change this image, as well as the workflow that we're going to take. We said that this image is too dim and muddy and lacks proper contrast, so we need to raise the highlights and lower our shadows. We also need to raise the tonality of our flesh tones. The image is also too cool, so we need to warm it up a bit. And we'll also be bumping up our saturation across the board. Workflow-wise, let me go ahead and display my Lumetri Scopes. Okay. We'll use the Luma waveform to make sure we set our light and dark values accordingly. Then we move on to the RGB Parade, where we'll be warming up the image by removing some of our cooler values. And then we'll move on to the Vectorscope to make sure our hue and saturation values are on target. Okay, so let's do this. As you can see, under basic correction, there are 2 main categories, white balance and tone, and there's also a saturation control. We're going to start here in tone because the first step of our workflow is to correct our light and dark values, which is what tone is all about. And there is an automatic control under tone, and what that's going to do is remap my darkest and lightest values. So I'm going to click on it, and when I do, watch both the image and the Luma waveform. All right, so you can see that the lightest values have been increased and the darkest values have been brought down. Now, I would say that usually the automatic control does this with a lot more conviction, getting the shadows nearer to 0 and the highlights nearer to 100. But with an image like this, where there are so many of the tonal values clumped together in the middle, I think it's avoiding the possibility of overcorrecting just in case there isn't a clear black and white value to map. So in a case like this, where I do indeed want more contrast, I'll use some of my manual tonal controls to get a lot closer. Specifically, I'm going to start by adjusting my whites and my blacks so that we can get those closer to 0 and 100. So I'm going to bring up my whites and bring down my blacks. All right, so the darkest parts of my image are now registering as black. Again, it's the shadows back here. And the lightest parts of my image, the apron strap, is almost at 100. It's sort of blowing out a little bit, so I don't think I want to go much more than that. All right, so after resetting my blacks and whites, I'll give you the before and after. Here's before, and here's after. So a big improvement already. Also, just as an aside, now that we've made some adjustments, if I come over to my Effect Controls panel, you can see that the Lumetri Color effect has automatically been added. All right, and then under Basic Correction, here are all of those subcategories and parameters that I can make adjustments for. So you can adjust within here. Mostly you would do this if you need to keyframe a color correction effect. Otherwise, you'll work entirely within the Lumetri Color panel. Okay, so let's head back over to my Basic Correction tonal controls. We already know what it means when we adjust our whites and blacks, so let's go over the rest of these, and I'll start with exposure. As you look at the Luma waveform, you can sort of tell exactly what's going on here. As you increase exposure, it increases tonal values and expands the highlights. As you decrease exposure, it decreases tonal values and expands the shadows. Let me undo that. Let's go to contrast. Here you can see that contrast stretches the darkest and lightest parts of the image away from center when you increase contrast, and the opposite when you decrease contrast. It does this evenly, so you don't have the ability to separate the amount that the highlights are being adjusted from the shadows. Undo. But if you do need that control, you have highlights and shadows. You can see that the highlights adjust the lightest parts of the image while leaving the darkest ones alone, and vice versa for shadows. All right, so with all of that said, I'm going to make just a few adjustments to improve my tonal range a little bit further. All right, so I think she's still just a little too washed out, so I'm going to increase my contrast. And then we want to bring some detail back over here. This is a little too blown out, so I'm going to bump my highlights down a bit. Okay, you can sort of see that detail come back in her shirt. And I'm going to also bring my shadows down too. All right, and with those adjustments, I'm going to bring my exposure up just a hair. All right, so let's take a look at the before and after here. Here's before, and here's after. Now, the second part of the workflow is balancing our color channels and removing the color cast. In this case, we know that we need to warm up the image. Now, in my basic correction category, there aren't a ton of color balance controls, but let's look at the ones that are available. We've got temperature, we've got tint, and also a white balance selector. I'm going to start off with another automatic control, the white balance selector. And to use this, you just select the eyedropper and then click on a white part of your image. Again, I'll use my apron strap. By doing this, we've told Premiere what should be white, and then it attempts to remove the color cast by balancing my color channels. You can see that my red, green, and blue color channels are more balanced than they originally were. Let's take a look at what's actually changed. As you can see, as a result of my automatic control, both temperature and tint have been adjusted, but of course I can reach in and tweak these more if I want. The temperature control lets you warm up or cool down the image by generally uniform amounts. The tint slider does much the same thing, except along the green-magenta spectrum. So you can see how the image has shifted a bit towards green in color balancing the shot. The problem with these basic controls is that it's uniform. You're not able to add more blue or more orange to just the highlights or just the shadows or just the midtones. So that's why the RGB Parade has gotten more in alignment, but it's not perfectly balanced. To dig in deeper there, we'll have to access more advanced controls, which we will later in this chapter. And finally, another color control you have within the basic category is saturation. And this slider increases or decreases saturation of all colors in the image equally. Okay, so I'm going to bump up my saturation looking at the Vectorscope as I do so. All right, and let's look at a final before and after. Here's before, and here's after. Okay, so a big improvement even with just the very simple controls in the basic correction category. Now, if you like, you can go through the next two images on your own, first correcting the tonal range, then removing your color cast, and then adjusting the hue and saturation in order to make each image look its best for the eyes and in the scopes.